there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and today I'd like to talk about Doctor Who. That's right. It's actually been a while since I've talked about Doctor Who on my channel. A couple articles recently from DoctorWhoTV.co.uk. Basically, the Moff, himself, in the production notes of one of the latest issues of Doctor Who magazine, was asked by a reader, how could the tomb that the Doctor finds in the name of the Doctor, which is essentially a TARDIS tomb containing his time scar or timeline, whatever you want to call it, his soul, his essence, how could that be there in that episode if, of course, by the time of the Doctor, he'd prevented his own death? And that's a perfectly valid question, I guess. I'm somebody who usually fills in those gaps on my own, but before I get to my interpretation of that, let me read how the Moff, in part, I'm not going to read his entire thing, and go check out the article, I'll link it below, but I'm going to read some selected bits of this, how the Moff responded. Essentially, he says he too has wondered this very fact, and he was told by the Doctor himself, air quotes, changing time is tricky. It's a bit like a detective story. So long as there isn't an actual body, you've got a certain amount of wiggle room. For instance, if the body has, rather conveniently, been burned on a boat in Utah. Waka waka, he's calling back to Series 6. Here's the thing. I can change the future so long as the future has not already been established as part of my own past. I can't rescue Amy and Rory because I already know that I didn't. He goes on to say essentially that the Doctor told him the TARDIS tomb may or may not actually be his TARDIS tomb. Maybe it's exactly what we think it is. Maybe it's something else entirely. He doesn't want to find out, anytime soon if it's at all avoidable, that kind of thing. The main thing is the emphasis, for the story is that Clara did, in fact, jump into his timeline using that portal, thus validating the fact that, yes, it is his tomb and it was his time scar and soul and essence and everything, no matter what the Doctor or the Moff says. And that's established. That was done, said and done, finito, that's it. But there's wiggle room because there wasn't an actual physical corpse, essentially. And so the first point I have in reaction to this is, number one, why does the Moffat need, writing advice from a fictional character like the Doctor? No, I believe the Doctor is real. Let's consider the Doctor real. Why is Moffat getting writing tips from the Doctor? I realize he's just trying to be cutesy and fun and, hey, let's all have a fun imagination. Well, if we had a fun imagination and things were done right, we really wouldn't need to keep explaining all these things. Secondly, okay, here's how it really went down. I can summarize this in just a few select words. Let me do that thusly. The Doctor changed the events that led, or probably would have led, to his TARDIS tomb and subsequently his death, with the help of Clara and the Time Lords, who gave him a new regeneration cycle, thus he didn't die whenever he was supposed to, leading to that TARDIS tomb. Time effectively was rewritten. You could have just said that. Done. Finito. That's all that needed to be said. The Doctor rewrote that moment. You can't really say this was an established event because it was current. It was the current Doctor's TARDIS. It was his future incarnation so far as he knew. It wasn't his past. Even if we adhere to this comment from the Doctor himself, air quotes, that, it wasn't established as part of his own past, all right, fine. This wasn't his past. He was there before his time. So, boom, time got rewritten. I just don't understand why people are having so much trouble with this concept. Maybe this reader was a younger reader, younger fan of the series, isn't quite used to the timey-wiminess and all of that. And these are just some opinions I have on some speculatory material as well as some what I think should be more easily answered than the Moff takes the time to do. I think there's a level of being clever, and then there's a level of just kafutzing it all, much more out of whack, bending it and twisting it much more out of whack than it needs to be when simplicity is king. With Doctor Who, simplicity needs to be king. Yes, we want stories that are mysteries, that are timey-wimey, that are very interesting, that involve us and make us feel the depth of the show, but you don't need it to be so further bent out of whack when you have to continually explain every little aspect after the fact. And I just think, it's making mountains out of molehills that really don't need to be there. One of the things you need to understand about Doctor Who, the reason it has such a longevity is because it's constantly reinventing the wheel. It's constantly, while it keeps the core essentials, the Doctor, the TARDIS, the running from Gallifrey, although, of course, he's running toward Gallifrey in a sense. At least, I hope that journey doesn't come to a culmination anytime soon. But the point being, the Doctor's on the run. He's running. There's always running, as he says. And essentially, those things stay concrete. Those are the things you keep set in stone. Things that are real-world history, those things, I think, leave them alone. Kennedy died in 1963. I know there was some speculation about a story of the Doctor being there, trying to prevent it or what have you. And I think, there's a certain level of mileage you can do with something like that. But I think from a creative standpoint, from a respectable standpoint, the Doctor can't change that. The Doctor can't change Abraham Lincoln's assassination. The Doctor can't change the Vietnam War. The Doctor can't change World War II. Yes, events around those can be manipulated to a point, but as long as the end result stays locked in history, those are the events the Doctor should not be able to manipulate, the established points in time. But the second article I wanted to talk about, a guest contributor on, again, Doctor Who TV, was basically talking about, could the TARDIS finally become a permanent companion of sorts? And they were kind of weighing the pros and the cons through three different aspects that this might be achieved, one of which was a hologram, which is the one I'm most gangbusters for as an idea. I figure the downside is just one, and that is, Quantum Leap. Kind of already beat you to it. We don't necessarily want it to be a Sam and Al situation in Doctor Who. I think that would be locking things down a little bit too much. But if this was a situation that came up on certain occasions, not necessarily for an entire season where the Doctor's interacting with the TARDIS hologram, I like one of the aspects that are mentioned in this article to do with the hologram aspect is that you could have different guest stars, as this holographic interface. Let's say Carol Ann Ford, something we, if we go back to the Day of the Doctor, in my video after that, I talked about, could it have been that much better, even greater than it was? I said, why couldn't the moment have been aspects and facets of former companions' faces, or what have you, or the Doctor's family, those kinds of things. You could have William Russell as Ian Chesterton, as an older man, as the TARDIS holographic interface. Same with Susan Foreman, his granddaughter. All these things. It's a really fascinating, exciting prospect. They could get a lot of story mileage out of it. It could be a thing where the only thing I don't agree with about the holographic thing is that it would have to be so closely contained to the TARDIS. Have the Doctor embed an interface, sort of link in his skull or whatever, in his ear, so that as long as the Doctor is in, range of the TARDIS, if the TARDIS is still within our universe, no matter how far he gets from it, he can still interact with the interface. Maybe it's something he can only see and hear again, getting into Quantum Leap territory. I'm a little bit iffy on that. I don't want it to turn into Quantum Leap as much as I loved and still love Quantum Leap. Doctor Who, a Quantum Leap is not, put it that way. The other aspects were, an android. I'm kind of meh on that idea. Not really excited by the idea. We saw how well Chameleon worked. I mean, unless, as I talked about in one of my videos for my Great Companions Who Never Were, I talked about the sentient robot, or the closest robot to being sentient, in the Robots of Death back in the Tom Baker era with Leela and everything. I talked about in that particular video, it would be much more, manageable having a robot or android that was a person in a costume, in a suit. I think especially with a lot of the on-location filming and stuff like that, as long as it wasn't sweltering heat, you could have somebody in a costume. Get the costume made out of a light fabric, something breathable. The most heavy piece would have to be maybe a helmet or mask. If you go back, like I said, to that aspect of the way the robots in the Robots of Death looked, you could have a robot companion. All you'd need to do is whatever actor's inside, or maybe, of course, Nick Briggs, who does the voice of the Daleks, Cybermen, all of those, whatever. You could have him do the voice, that kind of stuff. I think that would be a lot more manageable than a prop, a la Canine or Chameleon, and that stuff. I think that would be an interesting idea, but I love the holographic thing even more. And then, of course, the final estimation was, as a voice alone, the TARDIS would have sentience and be able to communicate as a sort of disembodied voice. And the cons were already listed in the article for that one. Not a lot of story mileage, not a lot of building up this character as a character, making it something relatable and everything like that. You're not going to be able to relate to a disembodied voice unless you happen to be hearing them, and then why are you watching Doctor Who? Shouldn't you be in an asylum? All the Daleks. So this video has rambled on for quite a long time, and I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. Realize I won't be able to respond because of Google+, and I'm a mobile-only user with all things online. But as I say, I love to hear your guys' thoughts, and I would like you to keep the comments as brief as possible, because, again, Google+ cuts them off after the first paragraph and a half. But I'd love to hear what you think of this. Do you think it's actually a lot more simple than the Moff usually makes it out to be with these timey-wimey events? Is he just adding more fuel to the fire and making mountains out of molehills, like I say? Or do you think there's some validity to what the Moff has said, and he's a creative genius, and he's God, and I should be bowing down and kissing his pearly white toes, and that kind of thing. So yeah, otherwise that'll be pretty much it for me on this. I hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.